There was this mythical aircraft out there called Aurora. There were rumours it was based out of the UK for a while at a remote Scottish base called RAF Machrihanish. The SR-71 Blackbird was retiring. We had a generation of analog satellites which was coming to an end and was being retired, phased out of service, deorbited. This thing just filled a gap, and when it had done its job of filling the gap, they went back to spy satellites.
Interesting.
I grew up next to RAF Machrihanish, correctly regarded as Scotland's Area 51, because it has these unique characteristics. A clear run over the Atlantic Ocean, not passing over land. One of the longest UK runways, isolated from major population centres. But today, I can add a few more little known details about this base. Machrihanish had exotic aircraft fuel and handling facilities, very secure hangars with tight base security, underground facilities, and was one of the most capable refueling bases in NATO. Machrihanish didn't just have jet kerosene, but had tanks of exotic fuels, including liquid helium for novel pulse, ram and scramjet engines. It was also a major import hub for NATO weapons and stores into Europe. I know that because my father was the UK government customs official at the base during the Cold War. That's why I lived there as a teenager. We lived a while close to the base. I, as a teenager, got my new Russian Zenith camera confiscated by RAF Machrihanish base security. But it was returned to my father with this note: "Tell your son not to take any more photos." I guess I'm still that wayward kid today. So people, did Aurora actually land at Machrihanish? Yes, but it was probably not the single aircraft project that you expected me to tell you about. For years, the Aurora myth remained unsolved. Rumours of anti-gravity black triangles or hypersonic Mach 7 stealth aircraft filled the news. Today, from my limited experience, I can tell you that all the rumours were true. But what exactly was Aurora? And where is it today? That question remained until I saw this interview on the Jesse Michael YouTube channel with Nick Cook from Jane's Defence Weekly.
There was this mythical aircraft out there called Aurora. There are very good pointers to say it existed, not least of which was it appeared a pretty firm conviction by the UK MOD that it existed, and that appearances of this aircraft over the UK, there were rumours it was based out of the UK for a while at a remote Scottish base called RAF Machrihanish. So there was that side of things. I had a fascinating talk with an RAF pilot that I ran into once, who said that he had talked to pilots who had encountered the Aurora in the North Sea, over the North Sea. The SR-71 Blackbird was retiring. We had a generation of analog satellites, which was coming to an end and was being retired, phased out of service, deorbited. And there was a new generation of these keyhole satellites. I think it was KH-11 keyhole satellites, which were digital satellites, which fed real-time imagery back to Earth. He said, but we had a gap between the two. We had no SR-71. We had no satellite coverage. So what would you do? So, well, what I would do is pretty much what most people, Bill Sweetman included, kind of think Aurora was, which was what they call a deployable prototype. So you build a few to test the concept, see if it works. You might send it on a few missions. You might even deploy it to somewhere like the UK for a bit. But, this thing is expensive. It drinks whatever fuel it uses. And whilst it has a utility, the utility of a thing like Aurora, even when you have spy satellites, is that you know when spy satellites are coming over and you can scoot and hide from them. You don't know when a hypersonic aircraft is coming over, or you don't have much warning time. So there was real utility in this thing. This thing just filled a gap. And when it had done its job of filling the gap, they went back to spy satellites.
Interesting.
What Nick Cook is suggesting is very smart, not concentrating on Aurora's advanced features, but asking these big questions. What were Aurora's requirements, and why was it being funded now? These are the spy systems of my youth. The U-2 spy plane, capable, beautiful design, but not too fast, and sadly, as Gary Powers found out, it did not fly quite high enough to avoid Soviet surface-to-air missiles. Enter the A-12, also known by the US Air Force as the SR-71. Mach 3 fast, it flew high and even had one or two early stealth features, such as plasma shielding on nacelle engine spikes and radar-absorbent skin-covering gunk. And in space at the time, the National Reconnaissance Office, or NRO, still used Corona, a film-based spy satellite system that ejected exposed film back down to Earth. Very retro. By the 1990s, the NRO dreamed of this: enemy of the state.
Congressman Sam Albert, how do we draw the line between protection of national security, obviously the government's need to obtain intelligence data, and the protection of civil liberties, particularly the sanctity of my home? You've got no right to come into my home.
Real-time video surveillance from space. But the problem was it wasn't quite available yet. A new breed of real-time spy satellites were being built. KH-11, Echelon. You've seen one of those. The Hubble Space Telescope. Hubble was a lightly modified KH-11 spy satellite, pointing up at space, not pointing down at us. But the new Echelon system was expected to need constant upgrades as better cameras and processing computers were developed. It was designed to be recovered or worked on in space by a novel manned spaceship called STS, or Space Transport System, launched out of Vandenberg, California. Hang on, that's the shuttle. Yes, NASA ended up running STS for the NRO and CIA, but it was horribly delayed. Setbacks in supplies by the lowest bidder, and the insanely stupid Challenger disaster, where Reagan insisted a delayed launch go ahead despite dire warnings from the solid booster builders Morton Thiokol. That delayed STS for over 3 years, and so delayed the full capabilities of Echelon real-time spy satellites. And the U-2 and A-12 planes were also coming to the end of their life. This hiatus caused a scary spy gap at a crucial part of the Cold War. The Soviets were building mobile nuclear launchers. The Cold War was at its hottest. The USA needed real-time info, so they threw money at fixing that problem. So to fill that gap before the Echelon real-time video constellation was fully operational, spy planes were still vital. So a massive budget was approved for new ones. But if you're going to get Lockheed Martin and others to build you a new spy plane, I bet you've got a wish list. The NRO had a list. They wanted higher, faster, stealthier, unmanned, real-time data super-duper spy aircraft.
I covered the Aurora story back in the late 80s and the 90s with my colleague Bill Sweetman. And I think we did some pretty good work, Bill especially, in picking apart the mysteries of Aurora. One of the things that Bill noticed was that there was a line item in the Pentagon budget in around 1990 that set aside around $2 billion for that year for a project called Aurora. It seemed pretty reasonable to suppose that, given the funding, that Aurora was not just one program, but probably a series of programs that covered reconnaissance. It was actually in the reconnaissance portion of the DoD's budget at the time, so that wouldn't be an unreasonable guesstimate. So yeah, we picked apart the Aurora program, and I think we made some pretty good progress at the time as to what it was.
So what was it and why was it? And that's the big picture that you've asked. The timing is spectacularly interesting. I mean, we have U-2 and A-12 SR-71s, and we still probably had the end of the Corona project. Why did the National Reconnaissance Office and the USA and allies need a new spy plane project?
Well, as you know, Simon, no one has said anything officially about Aurora, but they have provided some clues. And the best clue I think I got was, I reckon this was in 1998, and I was interviewing the outgoing US Air Force head of research and development, a man named General George Molnar. And General Molnar and I had on our agenda for discussion that day black projects. We were actually going to talk about black programs officially on the record. And in the course of that conversation, I asked General Molnar about Aurora, and he started to obliquely describe a capability gap that existed between the SR-71 Blackbird, which was being retired in around 1990, and the coming online of a new generation of spy satellites, I think it was the KH-11 series, which had a real-time digital capability. Now, in that gap, America needed intelligence. And so he strongly suggested or asked me to consider the possibility of a platform that would appear at short notice over the horizon and deliver pretty much real-time intelligence on pop-up threats. And this was an era of pop-up threats because, of course, it wasn't just the tail end of the Soviet Union, but it was also a time of great instability in the Middle East. We had the Gulf War in 1990 and 1991, which was sort of the time that Aurora, the platform or the platforms, was or were very active.
Multiple test beds for engines, fuels, stealth designs, sensors, and unmanned platforms. These were all secretly flown in and based at Machrihanish. So stop. I guess you and I are asking the obvious question. Why did they test them in Scotland? They could have easily tested these platforms in the US, in Nevada. Well, the answer to that question, why test a new generation of spy planes in Scotland, is really fascinating.
The time that Aurora was reported to be operating from Machrihanish
was around the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union. So you had a lot of pop-up stuff that you wanted to keep an eye on, like the movement of intermediate range ballistic missiles. You'd want to keep very close tabs on those. Of course, it was a time of instability in the Middle East. That we had the invasion of Kuwait in August 1990. And that was also a time of a reported time of strange aircraft movements coming in and out of Machrihanish. So I think what you need to do if you want to be a sleuth about this, you need to look around the world, see what was happening in adversary states that were going through of the United States that were going through periods of great turmoil in areas like the Middle East, and go, well, what would you need if you had a gap in reconnaissance capability thanks to the retirement of the SR-71 and the non-appearance of a new generation of satellites? What would you need to fill the gap? And as General Mulner invited me to speculate when we sat down for our on-the-record briefing about black programs, maybe you'd want something very fast, quite stealthy, that would appear over the horizon, taking your adversaries by surprise, because you can, of course, predict the appearance of spy satellites, but you can't predict the appearance of a hypersonic reconnaissance aircraft. And, that it all begins to make a kind of sense.
My family and local people in Kintyre saw and heard these test aircraft, but that news was never shared by our local media. We were kept quiet. But in the 1980s, multiple triangle craft were seen over Europe, including this one by a trained aircraft spotter. He sketched this black triangular craft being refueled and escorted over the North Sea. So what do we know? Well, here are the known facts of the Aurora test aircraft program. 1. Aurora tested liquid compressed gas fuel, delivered and stored at Camelton Lock POL underground stores and pumped or tanked to RAF Machrihanish. 2. Prestwick Air Traffic Control directed high Mach number test aircraft down through commercial flight levels into RAF Machrihanish. 3. Aurora tested novel stealth materials, such as BAE-developed metamaterial radar refracting tiles. A better stealth solution than the nasty RAM or radar absorbent coating that worked by having tiny metal balls in a sticky glue covering aircraft skin. RAM was easily damaged and needed constant reapplication. Metamaterials are stronger, even capable of forming the outer airframe skin. They work at the nano level. Incredibly small internal structures deflect microwave radar energy. But why test in Scotland? For one classified reason. The UK at the time had NATO's best stealth detecting radar. Hidden on Scottish mountains or staying out of the enemy gaze at Fylingdales are better stealth testing radar than anywhere in the USA at that time. Aurora was real, but Aurora was a project name, not a single aircraft. Aurora was a test platform for a new design group of NRO spy planes, and it came with a wish list. Faster, higher, unmanned, real-time, and stealthier. But did Aurora use non-human technology, gravity modification, and the weaponization of UAP? It might have, but it was more likely a stopgap spy plane project, waiting for real-time satellite video surveillance that today is horribly real. So what did they end up building? What aircraft types emerged from the Aurora project? I can't tell you, but like you, I can look around. Today we have sophisticated metamaterial stealth down to optical wavelengths. Over 80% of US Air Force aircraft are now unmanned, probably including the new generation of B-2s. High-altitude unmanned drones with long-loitering real-time multi-sensor technology are now commonplace. And don't forget pseudo-satellites, high stratosphere buoyant craft with AI Gorgon stare surveillance, time-based media that can track targets from the past into the present and even predict the future. These are pretty amazing, beyond the Hollywood dream of enemy of the state. Just maybe like something you saw here, being tested in Scotland before its deployment to Kuwait.
I'm not an expert on Calvin, however you pronounce it, but I have a lot of issues with what I have seen of the story. To me, there is just a strong whiff of disinformation running right the way through it. And again, what we were saying earlier, Simon, I think applies to Calvin in that you have to look around at what was happening at the time of this purported sighting. As far as I recall, it was August 1990.
Yep.
And it was within days of Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. So whilst it could have been something up there, I don't dismiss that possibility. For me, the sort of the weird scrambled noise around the whole Calvin story is more redolent of some efforts to distract from something very real that was going on at the time. And if I could put money on what that was, that's much more likely to be something like Aurora, which may have been operating out of Machrihanish at that time, given that a staging post like the UK would have been needed to keep tabs on the movement of military hardware and military forces such as Saddam Hussein's at the time of the invasion of Kuwait. So I buy that explanation much more readily than I buy the sort of the UFO hype around the Calvin sighting, which is that it was the testing of something really weird and exotic and sort of anti-gravitational and stuff. So that's my hunch.
What, Nick, did Aurora end up becoming? What have we got today that can deliver what the NRO, the CIA, Five Eyes, and everybody needs for world observation? Describe some of the platforms which are actually available and used today.
Well, I'll start that by saying that when I sat down with General Mulner to talk about, secret capabilities, which may or may not have existed in the US Air Force at the time, he invited me to speculate as to why sightings of Aurora and stories of Aurora were relatively short-lived. And we've talked about the gap in capability between the retirement of the SR-71 and the emergence of a new generation of spy satellites with real-time digital downlink capability and uplink capability. So General Mulner had strongly hinted to me that a platform like Aurora would be incredibly expensive to operate. So you'd want it in this short-term gap where you had no capability, but you wouldn't want to keep running it. The other thing about that was that when we covered the stealth fighter story, and bear in mind, the stealth fighter flew in secret, in squadron strength between 1983 and 1988, when it was finally admitted to and revealed. But lots of people reported sightings of stuff, around the desert. There were also crashes of F-117s, sometimes in and around sort of on the edges of quite populated areas. And those had to be covered up. And people like me were asking the DoD really annoying questions like, is there a stealth fighter which you're covering up? And the DoD said, and the government said, no, there isn't. There is no stealth fighter. Well, this is all about semantics, because as we later learned, it wasn't a fighter. It was an attack aircraft. So we then learned to ask better questions about Aurora. And instead of going, is this some kind of, SR-71 replacement, or being very sort of niche in our questions, we broadened the questions out so that the DoD had nowhere to run to when it was trying to give us evasive answers.
Right.
What that gives it, in my opinion, is a problem even to this day, because effectively it had no let out for its lies, which you're allowed to tell under special access rules. So there's nothing anti-constitutional about that.
Right.
But it does give politicians a very big problem, a big credibility problem. So my guess is that they went and dropped Aurora into a deep, dark hole somewhere in the desert, never to see the light of day again. And, people ask me, do secrets hold for a long time? And they're often asking this about the UFO conundrum.
Right.
And I go, yes, they do. They really do hold or they can hold for a very long time. And I think Aurora is a classic example of a technology that really existed, whose secret is pretty much, by and large, in place to this day.
Please share your information in the comments or in a personal message in great confidence to me. Thanks so much for watching. Press the new button, hype, or share. If you learned something new or hated what I said, vote now with a thumbs up or a thumbs down, because either demonstrate engagement equally to YouTube. Hey folks, because of you, the truth is out there.